Our first reading this morning is a brief selection from James Cone's work, God of the Oppressed. The Reverend Dr. James Cone was an ordained minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a professor at Union Theological Seminary, and the author of numerous books, many of which explained his Black liberation theology, of which he was known as a founder or father. We read together just a short piece today. He writes, "There is no true liberation independent of the struggle for freedom in history. History is the immanent character of liberation. It is the project of freedom. The imminence of liberation is visible whenever the emancipation of people from the chains of slavery takes place in history. There's no liberation without transformation, that is, without the struggle for freedom in this world. There's no liberation without the commitment of revolutionary action against injustice, slavery, and oppression. Liberation, then, is not merely a thought in my head. It is the socio-historical movement of a people from oppression to freedom, Israelites from Egypt, Black people from American slavery. It is the mind and body in motion, responding to the passion and the rhythm of divine revelation and affirming that no chain shall hold my humanity down. Liberation is not a theoretical proposition to be debated in a philosophy or theology seminar. It is a historical reality born in the struggle for freedom in which an oppressed people recognize that they were not created to be seized, bartered, deeded, and auctioned. To understand the question of liberation, we need only hear the words, experience the mood, and encounter the passion of those who have to deal with the dialectic of freedom and oppression in the concreteness of their everyday existence.
Our second reading this morning comes from the book of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12 and 14 through 16. You may know part of this selection as the Beatitudes. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds.
Whenever I think of or hear the Beatitudes, part of the Sermon on the Mount, I think of two things. First, I promise you this is true. The first thing I think of is the Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian. Okay, so this is a movie that humorously explores the life of Brian, who was born in the stable next to Jesus. And there's a scene in which Brian and his mother have gone to hear Jesus preach, but they're so far back in the crowd that they can like barely hear. And one of them goes, "Blessed are the cheesemakers? What's so special about the cheesemakers?" And someone nearby goes, "Well, obviously it's not meant to be taken literally. It refers to any manufacturers of dairy products." It's a classic movie. It's worth a watch if you haven't seen it. And I promise, I cannot hear "Blessed are the peacemakers" without thinking "Blessed are the cheesemakers." And I am indeed very grateful for the cheesemakers. And then the other thing that I always think of when I hear these lines is I think of this enormous stained glass window in the building of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation, First U of Philadelphia. It's a huge, beautiful round window. It shows an angel carrying a banner that reads, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." And I looked at that window Sunday after Sunday for about 5 years when I lived in Philly. I had moved there for grad school, knowing no one, and I was miserable. And my mother told me, "Go find the Unitarian Universalist congregation." She said, "Get involved, make friends, find your people," and I did. And that congregation, as all our congregations are, was full of folks of diverse belief. And Philly is pretty transient, so people were coming and going, looking for a place to belong. And that window was a holdover from back when this church building was built hundreds of years ago, when it was a Unitarian congregation, before the merger even, when Unitarianism was more Christian than it is now. I have said before, and I'll say again this morning, I am not a Christian. I do not center my theology and my belief around Jesus. I do not go first to the Christian scriptures for my wisdom and truth and comfort. But that window moved me each week, and the Beatitudes, those lessons of Jesus, remain a favorite. Blessed are the poor, those who mourn, those who hunger and thirst, the pure of heart, the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are on the edges, the fringes. Blessed are those that are being oppressed and marginalized, kept down, kept out. Blessed are those in need. Blessed are those in need of liberation. The sermon that Jesus delivers in that moment is not filled with empty platitudes. His words echo plenty of other stories in the scriptures of him aligning himself with the outcasts, lepers and prostitutes and more. And there is within Christianity a strand of theology that understands this as one of the most important, if not the most important feature of Jesus's incarnation and God's nature. And that theology is called Liberation Theology. In a nutshell, it is the belief that God in God's entirety is always on the side of the oppressed, always backing those who seek liberation, always aligned with those without privilege. In more detail, the logic of this theology is that if God sent Jesus, who is by Christian understanding also divine, to live and die for human sins, then this shows that God is on the side of the underdog, in this case, humans. The interpretation is that God wants to help and raise up those in need, and that Jesus, by his actions and words while on earth, is clearly on the side of those being harmed by cultures and systems and structures of oppression and prejudice. And so the theology states, God in all of God's forms wants to help and heal and liberate. Now, liberation theology really first arises in the aftermath of Vatican II in Latin America. Primarily coming into being among Catholic theologians, this was a theology that spoke directly to the experience of those seeking freedom, political and social freedom. Liberation theology has come to exist around the world, wherever folks are oppressed and are in need of encouragement and hope. The first of our readings this morning was from James Cone, renowned for his work on Black liberation theology, for his teaching and his speaking. Black liberation theology specifically contends with the history of violence and slavery in this country, along with the question of whether or not Christianity is only a tool of the oppressor. So throughout the world, right, as Western European empires spread, Christianity spread with it, right? In the form of missionaries, governments based on Christian values. Christianity was forced on indigenous folks and absorbed into itself local and indigenous rituals and ideals. We can see this all the way back in Christianity's spread in the early Middle Ages into the Germanic lands of Northern Europe, and aspects of those on-the-ground traditions were retained and recast and put inside of the Christian tradition. And it continues to happen throughout colonization. The calculation being, let them keep a little bit of what matters to them to keep them happy, but bring it inside our system, right? Never let them be completely themselves, make them come on board with what we are delivering. And then Christianity was used at times to try and convince folks that they need not change their fate or rock the boat. God has a plan, you'll be redeemed in heaven after suffering here, so don't worry about it if you're in pain now. Later on, you're going to be okay. Liberation theology turns the idea that Christianity belongs to the powerful, or that Christianity is about accepting what is, it turns those on their head and says, yes, those in charge, those encouraging and creating the oppression have distorted the reality of this faith and this faith leader in the form of Jesus in order to maintain their power. But that when we peel back the layers, Christianity has lived on the ground since the beginning in oppressed communities is really about a God that suffers with you, longs for and sacrifices for your freedom, and is intent on liberation for all, not only in the next life, but also in this life. That is what liberation theology teaches. And that piece about this life is one of the hallmarks of liberation theology. It concerns itself not only with the redemption of Jesus' life and death in terms of human salvation in the end, but also it concerns itself, we might say primarily concerns itself, with freedom and liberation in this lifetime, in our human context. And that's what our first reading from James Cone was really addressing, that social and historical context matter, and liberation and freedom and justice are things that are necessary right now. We can say that liberation theology is taking the tool of the oppressor and using it instead as a call to dismantle the systems and structures of privilege and bring about a world of justice and equality. There's a phrase in liberation theology that perhaps you've heard before, the preferential option for the poor, which expresses the call to side with, labor on behalf of, pay special attention to, advocate for, give preference to the poor, and extend it out the otherwise marginalized. Liberation theology is about justice grounded in faith, about the most powerful suffering alongside us, being with us in our pain and demanding our freedom. As our political landscape has shifted, we have begun to witness a clear preference for those with power, with money, with privilege, for those on the inside. Foreign aid has been slashed. Government workers are being instructed to turn in anyone they believe to have been hired because of diversity initiatives. LGBTQ folks have every reason to fear that protections for their working and living and loving will be stripped. We're going to talk about all of that in the weeks and months and years to come. But today, we're specifically focused on immigration. The new administration has attempted to try to change a lot all at once. Energy and priorities were focused from the first day on targeting the vulnerable among us who have traveled to this country from elsewhere. Oh, we are missing, there we go. Haha, that would have been terrible. My pages were out of order.
It's the fraction, Chris.
Thank you. Blame that. The administration has reinstated the Remain in Mexico policy, which says that asylum seekers, people who are coming to the United States because they fear for their lives and want the shelter of this country, must wait outside that shelter until they hear whether or not they'll be allowed in, which exposes them to the dangers that they are fleeing from while they wait. The administration has suspended refugee resettlements, leaving refugees who are already in the country in limbo. They've ordered the end of birthright citizenship, the right under the 14th Amendment to be a citizen if you are born within the United States, regardless of where your parents are from. Now, of course, there are already legal challenges to these new rules, and some will, like the Muslim travel ban, almost certainly be beaten. But others will be upheld by a legal system that does not extend the full rights of the Constitution to non-citizens. Whatever the laws are that they're trying to pass, whatever will come of those, the reality on the ground is that this administration is already deploying troops to the border, bringing a militant and thus violent approach to managing migration and immigration. And just as the war on drugs turned policing into war, this leadership seeks to turn the administrative process of accepting new people into our country into a war. All of these policies, these changes, and this approach, it is all built on lies about immigration statistics and built on rhetoric that dehumanizes and urges people to view migrating people, in particular migrating people of color, as murderers, rapists, gang members, diseased. There are accurate and true statistics to be had about immigration, if you would like to go find them. The Pew Research Center reminds us that 77% of immigrants are here legally. The American Immigration Council reminds us that of the 13.8% of folks living in the US that are foreign born, that's just over 46 million folks, of that number, a full 74% are proficient in English, not that it actually matters, but just to counteract the lies. In 2022, that group of folks paid $579 billion in taxes. The entrepreneurs among them alone generated $110 billion in business income. Immigrants make up nearly a quarter of the agriculture and construction workforce, as well as nearly a quarter of the workforce in STEM. By and large, immigrants are here legally, are contributing to the economy, are working productively, and often are working in fields that are struggling to find enough workers anyway, including medical support fields. Now, I share these statistics, and we could share so many more, by way of disproving some of the dehumanizing lies that seem to be accepted as truth by far too many folks. But there is another part of me that wants to shout, it also doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether or not they are working productively. It doesn't matter whether or not the tax revenue is this billion or that billion. In a country of vast resources, we have enough to give if we wanted to. We have room to invite more inside. A human does not need to prove their right to asylum, to safety, to security, to the basic human rights like food and water and shelter and opportunity. The dehumanizing appeals are the exact opposite of liberation theology. Liberation theology does not engage in the attempt to divide people into those who are worthy of liberation and those who are unworthy. Liberation theology is built on the belief that every single person is born with an innate freedom and liberty, and that no human structure has the right to strip those freedoms and liberty away. In fact, liberation theology calls us to oppose and tear down the structures that strip away freedom and liberty. It calls us to overturn the tables in the temple and sit ourselves down with those outside the gates and touch the leper and honor the prostitute and align ourselves every time with those who are being harmed, who are hurting, who are being kept outside. At the beginning of this sermon, I told you again that I am not a Christian. I like Jesus, he was cool, right? But he is not the center of my belief system. And I use the word God, but it means something pretty outside normative theism to me. So the question naturally arises for those of us who do not consider ourselves followers of Jesus or believers in God or Christians, how do we understand this Christian theology of liberation? How do we apply it? Why should we care? Right? In Christian liberation theology, we begin from the place of interpreting the scripture as teaching that God is on the side of the oppressed, and the next step is to see ourselves on the side of the oppressed as an expression of our desire to follow God's example, be like God, build the world we believe God longs for. So if you take God out of the equation, why should we align ourselves with the poor, the hungry, the oppressed, the immigrant? Fundamentally, why should we care about liberation and freedom? I think there are a lot of ways to answer this question. I will offer you some of mine, but I truly hope you will also share with me some of yours. I'll put an invitation on Realm because I want to hear what you think about this. But here are the ways that I begin to answer this question. One approach is to remember the very scientific fact of our interdependence. We are part of one human family, born in the dust and the chaos of the birth of the universe. We're one species. We share so much of our DNA. We are built from the same building blocks. And both our past and our futures are intertwined, and that is ever more true in our global world. Fundamentally, we are relatives, teammates, and we might say that we have a moral and ethical responsibility as well as an evolutionary one to care for one another. Another way to consider it is that wherever there are systems of oppression, we may find ourselves the next victim. When we let privilege and power reside in the hands of a few and let them enact violence against people based on identity and demographics, then no group is safe. Even if we imagine ourselves to be, we are not. In addition, you may have seen this, in addition to the call to deport non-citizens, you may have seen Bishop Buddy's sermon at the National Prayer Service. Since that, some lawmakers, members of Congress, have called for her deportation. She is a citizen, so no one is safe. So for our own sake, we are called to align with those at risk, knowing that we may well be next at risk. Yet another way to look at this, if all we have is here and now, and all we have is each other, then this world is only ever what we make it. We have the power to increase each other's joy and mitigate each other's sorrow. And every Sunday we speak about that, right? How we can increase celebration and decrease pain. We can decide and act to create a world of joy and love and support. And that changes our own experience of our own short life. Wouldn't a lifetime of peace and joy be so much better than one filled with anxiety and fear? And my last way that I'm going to answer this morning is about love and creativity. Fundamentally, I believe that the best of our humanness is our capacity for relationship, for creation, and for love. I often say that it is so much easier to destroy than it is to create. Think of like a little kid just smacking down a tower. It's much harder to build those blocks up. But creation, I believe in my core, is what we are called to. So if we are seeking to be our highest and best selves, expressed through love and creation, then we must seek to conquer oppression. Oppression is limitation and violence and harm. To be our best and highest selves, we have to seek liberation. Liberation is freedom and self-determination and justice and love. With or without God, we are called to compassion for those who are suffering. With or without God, we are called to advocate for justice for those who are oppressed. With or without God, we are called to build a world of greater kindness, safety, and joy for all. I believe that world is possible and that we can get there together.